We talked about this the last couple of weeks, that it's easy to fall in love, isn't it? Some of us have done it a bunch of times. Right? And we love falling in love, right? I mean, there's that feeling. It's like, oh, it just feels so good. I'm in love. And people will stop you and say, what's different about you, right? Something's going on. You're like, well, I'm in love. Like, oh, yeah, you know. But we all recognize how easy it is. We also recognize that that's not the hard part of love. The hard part of love is really the staying in love part. Because after the initial stuff kind of goes on, and after you begin to develop a relationship, after you begin to know the person, hang around with the person, and all those cute things that were so cute before aren't quite as cute anymore. The question of how do we make this thing last? How do we make it stick? And so that's where we're going to talk a little bit about this idea today, about what's the Bible talking about. And I'll be honest with you. The Bible does not say a lot about marriage. It does not say a lot about love. Best book on love is the Song of Solomon. If you haven't read it, you ought to read it. In fact, if you're married, read it to the other person. Read all the words out loud. Just a tip. If you're not familiar with it, you ought to go home and read it. But there's something in this whole idea of love. And sometimes I do a little bit of marriage counseling. I'm not a great marriage counselor. I've told you that before. Do not come see me if you got marriage trouble. Because I'm just real direct, right? You guys come to see me, I expect that you're coming for my help, right? That's why you're here to see me. So I make an assumption. You're here to see me. I'm going to hear your problems, then I'm going to tell you how to fix them. And in 2 weeks when we get back together, if you haven't done what I've told you, we'll try it one more time. And then you need to get to somebody this is really their expertise. Because I figure if you're coming to my help and I give you help and you don't want to follow that help, then we're not really helping anybody. And I don't want to be a bearer to you getting the help you need. But sometimes as I talk to people and you know, we get lost in this saying that we have, that you can't see the forest for the trees. You've heard that, right? There's also the other version, right? You can't see the trees for the forest. And sometimes it's true in our relationships. You know, some of us are in that spot of we can't see the forest for the trees. There's just that one thing. There's that one thing in our relationship that is just so, and it's become all about that one thing, and we get so locked in that one tree that we'll forget all the rest in the forest around us. Some of us were in the other side of things. We're in the forest side. We're just so much stuff going on, and going in so many directions, you know, and you got work, and you got school, and you got the kids, and they got places to be, and you got this program coming up, and you got this plan at spring break, and you got so much stuff that you're just overwhelmed by all the stuff that you miss the tree in the moment. And so today we're going to go to a passage, as Pastor Dave said earlier, is a tough passage, because it's written by a guy named Paul, and it's easy when you read these words to kind of get a little pushback, because we read it through our lens of our modern times. And we read it through our lens of our experiences. We read it through our lens of history. And we read it through the lens of saying, Paul, we understand, was never married. And we think to ourselves, who is a guy who's never been married to give marriage advice? Which actually isn't a bad question, because I think it's a valid question. It's pretty hard to give advice about something you really haven't done. Any of you go to in college or graduate school and your professors hadn't done the job they were trying to prepare you for? Anybody else have that experience? Or hadn't done it in like 50 years, you know? I remember being in graduate school, you know? They'd get these professors to get up and they would talk to you. It was graduate school for people like me, so they were talking about growing a church and how to pastor a church, how to do all this stuff. And then you found out that they had maybe pastored for like a year and a half, 40 years ago, which sort of lessened the draw of listening to this person for very long, because they always had all the answers, but really hadn't done that answer in a long, long time. So today we're going to try to find some answers. And the great thing is, if you're not a follower of Jesus, none of this applies to you today. So if you're here today because she's kind of cute, or he's hot and he comes here, or she's coming here, and so you're here today, but you're not really buying this whole religious stuff, that's okay. Maybe you get something out, but this doesn't apply to you. This is only for those of us in this space, in this room, and watching online. This is only for those of us who consider ourselves followers of Jesus. But if you're a follower of Jesus, everybody, I want you to say something with me. Everybody say, oh baby, because this is going to be one of those oh baby moments, all right? And the reality is, as we read this passage, we look at it through our eyes and we get some pushback from one part of our group today, the ladies. Can I hear from ladies today? That was kind of weak, ladies. But we get pushback from the ladies as they read this. And the guys are all like, hey, this is great stuff. But when this was originally written, we would have been a whole different scenario. So we're going to try to look at it back in the time, place, and situation when it was written and see if we can't discover something that'll even help us today. And we're going to wrap up today by giving you one question to ask. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship you're in, whether you're a child, whether you're a student, whether you're in a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, if you're in a marriage, if you are a parent, all that kind of stuff. There's one question I'm going to give you as we wrap up today that I think could literally change your life if you're willing not only to ask it, but to answer it. But before we go any farther, let's bow our heads and let's pray one more time together, right? Father, for those of us in this space today, we know it's easy to fall in love. And you've been observing all that parts of our life. You've seen us go through it. You've seen everybody who's ever lived and ever will live. You know this is part of the story. But for some of us, we have fallen in love, and now we find ourselves struggling to stay in love or finding it just hard at times. And we need to hear something that will encourage us to stick with it a little bit longer. We maybe need to hear a different perspective of what this is really about. And what are the choices we have in this? But no matter where we're at today in this space, all of us are in relationships, and all of us at times need help in those relationships. And so I just ask you to use this old letter from this guy named Paul and help us to read it in the way that he originally intended, the way you intended for people to understand it. And maybe, just maybe, that can help us today, not only in our relationship, but even in how we see ourselves and we see you. And so we invite you into this space now and ask for you to be with us in your name. Amen. All right, if you want to follow along, we're over in Ephesians chapter 5, and we're going to start at the start of Ephesians chapter 5 because what happens later in the chapter goes with what starts, right? And it's kind of like your conversations. You start one place, and you're going to go someplace later, and if somebody walks in on a conversation way later in the game, they're going to hear some stuff, and they're going to go, whoa, you were a little hard there, but you've forgotten all the stuff that goes ahead of time. So here's what and Paul is the guy, if you're not familiar with Paul, he has wrote the majority of the part of your Bible that we call the New Testament. And all the stuff he writes are letters to different people. This one is a letter he writes to the church at Ephesus. And here's what he says as he begins to wrap up this long letter. He says, you are God's children. And you're God's children whom he loves. So try to be like, that is, imitate him. I love how he starts, right? You are already loved by God. God loves you, right? And because he loves you, you ought to imitate him. You ought to try to live your life in honor of what that love means. Live a life of love, he says. Walk, that is, love is the literal translation. Just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. That's the invitation for us to live a life of love. Kofi prayed it earlier, this idea of a reckless love and about how we approach life. And Paul, as he begins this thing, says, this is how we ought to. Imitation looks like living this life of love. Just as Jesus loved us and as he gave his life, this sacrificial, this go to any length kind of love. That's the invitation Paul makes as he writes these words. That's what it looks like to imitate this God who calls us his children, who already loves us. A little bit later, he says, so be very careful how you live. That is, how you walk. And if you've read much of your Bible, especially the New Testament, especially Paul, you'll know he oftentimes talks about being very careful how you walk. And when he talks about walk, he's not making sure you don't step in your neighbor's dog's stuff, right? That's not his point there. It's about how we're choosing to live our life. And there's a reason that Paul comes back to this so many times. And that's the reality is, all of us, if we're honest, At times it's easy to kind of wander, right? At times it's easy to get distracted. At times it's easy to get sucked in, like this forest, the tree in the forest and get sucked in there, or just to get so overwhelmed by all the trees. So it's important, and Paul writes this often because he knows we oftentimes need to be reminded we need to be careful, very careful how we live. Because there's always stuff that wants to distract us. Do not live, that is, walk like those who are not wise. Don't walk like a foolish person, but live like those who are wise. And if you go back and read this passage, he will go through a long string of stuff. That's these distracting things, these things that want to pull us away. And he says, that's not a smart way. That's not a wise way to live. There's some wise ways to live. And then he begins to talk about what this looks like and what it looks like to have God not only as our Father, but God within our lives. And he goes through some of these applications. And then he comes and says these words. Yield, that is, submit, be subject to each other out of reverence, that is, respect, fear, and awe for Christ. This is verse 21 if you're following along out there. And this is the most key one for everything that's going to follow today. And as Paul says, this is what it looks like to live a God-focused, a God-lived-in life. We ought to yield. We ought to submit to each other. And when Paul writes this is actually good news for a lot of people. For wives, who we're going to get to in a moment, for women in general, for men and for husbands, that we'll get to a little bit later. He will write about how this is important for kids and how they relate to their parents, and for especially not just parents, but especially fathers and how they relate to their sons. He'll say to us as fathers, guys, we need to watch out. Be careful not getting so worked up about, your kids and how you discipline them and making this all about, I'm going to get some respect no matter what. And be careful of that, he says. And he also talk about slaves and masters, which I'm not going to talk about today, all right? Because it's just not what I'm going to talk about today, all right? But he does bottom line it for us. That if we're followers of Jesus, that we need to yield, that is, submit to each other. And we do it for a very important reason, out of reverence for Jesus, for what he's done. And here's the important point. Whenever we forget that Jesus is the model, we get in trouble. Anytime you're reading something in the Bible and you get a little worked up about, why is he saying that? Well, that can't be true. Why would they say that? They're telling me I can't do this, I can't do that. Take a step back and remind yourself that Jesus is the model. And that's what Paul writes about here. As Paul refers to this idea of reverence for Jesus, he's remembered everything that Jesus did for us. That Jesus lived, that he taught, that people wrote down the stuff so that we'd know what he said, that he would die for you. Whether you ever responded to him or not, he has already died for you. And he would come back to life to tell us that death is not the end. That the cost of your sins was not too high for him. And so we can't forget that Jesus is the model. Now, here's what the word submit means. Original language, it's actually a military term. It means to arrange, that is, in troop divisions in a military fashion under the command of a leader. How many veterans out here today? Raise your hand, be proud. Quite a few, all right, we got a few. If you've been in the military, it's about getting in your divisions, right? It's lined up. Submitting is, the sergeant says, get in line, everybody gets in line, right? I mean, you didn't have to even be in the military to know that, right? You watch enough military movies to know how that works, right? The guy yells at you, everybody gets in line, because when you don't get in line, bad stuff happens, right? So submission is, hear the mark, everybody gets in line. But there's also a non-military. And I love this. This is a voluntary attitude of giving in, of cooperating, of assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. That when I submit, it's a voluntary attitude. That when you hear somebody say, I submitted, it means they voluntarily chose, because nobody can force you to submit. And Paul is really saying here that this isn't a one-sided thing. This is a Jesus thing. That submission is really about how Jesus lived his life. And that's going to play as we come to the next part. See, submission isn't about control. It's about choice. Keep going, Lydia. I'm going to let it hang there for a minute, all right? I want you just to think about that. That submission is not about control. It's about choice. Sometimes the strongest people are the people that are most submitted to something because they've chosen to be submissive for a reason, for a purpose. And that's important to know as we get to this next part. And the word here is, if you're a wife, say it nice and loud. The word here is, all right. Husbands, men, other non-wives in the room, here's what you need to know. So if you're not a wife, you don't have to listen to the next about couple of minutes here, all right? Because it's not written to you. And if it's not written to you, it's not. So don't go home if you're a husband this afternoon. I'm going to give you a tip, guys. I want to make your Valentine's Day really good. Do not go home today and say, Pastor Mike said, wives, do not do that. Because this was not written to you. So it has no basis. You can't use this for anything. It's written to, say it again. One more time. We all clear? All right, here it goes. Wives, this is literally how it goes. Wives, to your husbands as you do to the Lord. Now, included in most of your versions of the Bible say yield, submit, be subject. That's because that's the intent. But this is not in there. He doesn't say wives submit. He just says wives to your husbands and to your Lord because he's based on the sentence he just wrote before, which is all of us are supposed to. Say it loud and proud, folks. There you go. Because it's a choice, right? And because of that, now he gets the personal application. And like I said, he's going to go on a lot of things. But right now to wives, he says, just like that, you got to to your husbands as you do to the Lord. Because the husband is the head of the wife. This is where it gets tough, huh? As Christ is the head of the church, which I'm glad he included that, right? Because we read that and we think, and I'm the head of the house. Mark off my property here. Let me tell you how it's going to be. Do you ever think Jesus did that? Guys, talks to the 12, right? His closest guys. Guys, you all need to know I'm the head of this group. Did Jesus ever, as far as we know, ever say those words? What did Jesus do? He taught them. He fed them. He invited them to be part of what he was doing. He forgave them. He encouraged them. He was clearly the head because they believed in who he was, and so they were submissive to him because they believed he was the Messiah. And so based on that, they were willing to submit and to follow and to act, do all the things that he said. That was their goal. Being a disciple was to be just like their master. But it was a voluntary master. And here's the crazy thing. When we read this through our modern day eyes, we think, how can he say, Paul's not even married. How can he tell us that we're supposed to be submissive to that husband? You ought to know my husband. I can't be submissive to him. Guy can't make a decision on his own if it could save his life, right? Don't clap, that's bad. See, today we look at it through our experiences. We look at it through history, right? When somebody demanded to be the head and reminded everybody that they needed to be submissive to them. But when Paul wrote these words, I believe that when Paul wrote these words, the people that were most offended was not the wives, but was the husbands. Because in Paul's day, women knew their place. I know that's going to sound bad. But everybody knew their place back then. Women were simply possessions. They were simply there to bear children, to cook the meals, to take care of the house. That was their job. They knew their roles. And when Paul writes these words that you're supposed to be yield to him, submissive to him, they understood that, but they loved the idea that he's saying, we're doing this not because he's the head of the household, we're doing this because this is about Jesus. In fact, they loved it in verse 12 or 21 when Paul wrote those words that you ought to yield to each other. Because all of a sudden they got some place. They were down here before. Now they're up here. They're equal now, which nobody ever made women equal back then. And we need to keep that in mind as we read this. He, talking about Jesus, is the Savior of the body, which is the church. He gave it all. He was willing to live. He was willing to cease to exist in order to provide for his body. As the church yields, that is submits, that is subject to Christ, so you wives should yield, submit, be subject to your husbands in everything. And those words were written to, so husbands, you have no idea what I just said, right? Go home, act clueless. If your wife said, do you really believe what Pastor Mike said about wives? She said, honey, I have no idea because it wasn't to me. So I wasn't paying attention. Next, we have, come on guys, help me out here, right? Husbands. So again, if you are not a husband, got it? So ladies, take a little break. Talk quietly amongst yourself, all right? So husbands, who again, when Paul writes these words, they would have been the ones that were a little over this. Today, the women are the over it. Back then, the guys would have been, because now all of a sudden, Paul put some expectations on them that wasn't there before. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Don't say that, Lydia. You're not supposed to be paying attention. I thought I was clear, Lydia. I forgive you. We're all good, all right? So husbands, Paul says you're supposed to love your wives as Jesus loved the church. And he'll go on and remind him, and gave himself for her. And he did it to make her holy and to sanctify her, to make her special. And all of a sudden, when the guys are reading this, they're going, whoa, hold it here, Paul. I like the whole head of the household stuff, even though I wasn't supposed to read that. I understand that. But now you tell me I have to love her? And love in a way that's sacrificial, love in a way that's giving? He did this, talking about Jesus, so that he could present the church to himself like a bride in all of her beauty, right? In splendor and glorious, and, it's that saying that there's never been a non-beautiful, bride at her wedding. I mean, it's just that moment. And he says, Jesus did all this so that he could present that way. And he goes on. He did it so there would be no stain or wrinkle or any other wrong thing in it, but she would be pure and without fault. And this is all about the picture of not saying, you can't do these things. This is about, he's bringing his bride in. And he sees her in that moment when the music plays and she walks down the aisle. And he thinks to himself, I've never seen her more beautiful and more perfect than at this moment. Paul says, husbands, that's how you ought to love your wife. Just like you did in that moment, you need to keep that picture there and give yourself towards that picture there. The man who loves his wife loves himself. In fact, if you go back and read this, in most versions, the words to the wives is about 60 words in those sentences. To the guys, to the husbands, it's about 190 words. Which ought to tell us something, right? That if you're giving more words to a guy, there must be something more important to him. I mean, if it had been the other way, we all would have gone, I get it, right? Because women, we're told, talk like twice as much as the men. Just science, folks. Nothing mad about, just science. But it's flipped here, which ought to tell us again that Paul is trying to drive the point home to the husbands. Man who loves his wife loves himself, because every man loved himself. But no one ever hates his own body, but feeds it and takes care of it. That's how we take care of it, especially in that culture. It was about the man and having everything he wanted, and that is what Christ does for the church. To sum it up, he says, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself. And a wife must respect that as reverence her husband. Which I'll take you back to the start. We cannot forget this is about what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus in a married relationship. That Jesus is the model behind all of that, not just between husbands and wives, it's the model behind all of our relationships. It ought to be the model you have with your kids. It ought to be the model you have with your parents. It ought to be the model you have to your coworkers. It ought to be the model you have towards your neighbors. And anytime we forget who the model is, we get ourselves in trouble, because then it becomes about my rights, my demands, what I need, what I have to have, and we forget this has nothing to do with that. This is really about who Jesus is and who Jesus is to you. And that submission isn't about control. It really is about choice. The wife who says, I am, by choice, being submissive, doesn't mean I'm being, he walks in the door and I worship the ground he walks in, and I have his slippers for him, and then the robe, and I have, some nice refreshment sitting there, and I have the daily paper set out. As great as that would be, folks, that's not what it means. It means that she's made a choice. And for the husband, he makes a choice as well to love just like Jesus loved. To see her as Jesus sees the church. To pour his life into it. To get everything just right so she is without spot, without wrinkle. The wedding dress is perfect. Her hair is perfect. Her nails are perfect. Her lips are perfect. I'm stopping at that point of perfect, all right? See, when we're in love, a lot of stuff doesn't matter. Right? Because you're in love. It's not a big deal. We don't make a big deal out of stuff. It's when that love begins to unravel a little bit that the stuff begins to matter. And let's be honest, in relationships, there's a lot of stuff to matter. There's the bills. There's money. There's the car. There's insurance. There's the doctor's appointments. There's the kids and their school, and the things we want them in, and all the different things they're part of. And then there's the job, and it just goes on, right? There's just lots and lots of stuff. And I think as Paul writes these words, he's trying to help us see a recipe for making this thing stick. And that foundation of all that stickiness is mutual submission. Because when Paul writes those words, he's writing to everybody. Men, women. Kids, old people, young people, middle-aged people, people that shouldn't be having kids, that have kids. He's writing to everybody. So let me share with you as we wrap things up today, the one question. And this is not original to me. In getting ready for the series a couple of months ago, I ran across this, and it was a moving story from a guy who had said his marriage was on the rocks, it was falling apart. They had just gotten to that place where everything mattered, right? And so he somewhere he had heard about this idea, and he said, I'm going to start doing this. And he began to ask this question every morning. And he said it transformed his relationship. And I've heard other people do something similar to this. And in fact, I've heard this. Kids, if you want to blow your parents' minds, you ask this question of them. You know, if at work, if you want to change your boss's attitude towards you, you ask this question at work. It literally is a question that could change everything if you're willing to ask it sincerely. So you got to put on your sincere face when you ask it, all right? And then you actually have to answer it, okay? Because you're going to ask them a question, they're going to give you an answer, then you actually have to do that answer so that it looks like you actually were sincere when you first asked the question. So you ready for the question? So tomorrow morning, kids, go to one of your parents, maybe the one that's easier on you, just to give you a good start here, right? And say, how can I make your day better? To which first they may say, whose kid are you? Or they could be like, put some plates on the table for breakfast. And you're going to be like, sweet, right? I put a few plates out, I put 4 plates out, and I have accomplished it. I've surprised him in the process, right? I mean, guys, if you ask her, she may say, clean out the garage, and you may think to yourself, oh, no. Because that's not like a part of the day thing. I'm glad football season's over because it's going to take me all day, right? Probably part of the night. But here's my challenge. Just try it, all right? But be genuine about it. Because what this is about you putting yourself in a submissive spot. What can I do to make your day better? And whatever they say, see if you can fill it. I mean, they may ask you something crazy, but if that's the case, you've got bigger problems than what I'm trying to deal with, all right? But give this a shot. Give this a shot for the rest of the month, and then come see me when we begin March and just say, hey, Mike, this really worked good, or I need to talk to you privately because I got a big issue. But what can I do? What can I do to make your day better? So let me wrap it up like I normally do with some what-if questions. What if staying in love is a you choice? It's a you choice. It's a choice of how you see things, how you respond to things, how you do things, how you will submit to things, how you put yourself in those places, things. What if this isn't about as much about them as it is about you? And secondly, what if this is really about being a follower of Jesus? What if it's so easy to forget that in our relationships, that how I treat my spouse, how I treat my kids, how I treat my neighbors, how I treat my coworkers, how I treat the people in and throughout life really is about me and my relationship with God and how that plays out. I hope you think about those things today.